The history of medicine is a long and complicated one, but from 1900 to the end of World War II, we saw arguably the most significant changes occur. From new possibilities for the disabled, to new cancer treatments, to almost a complete overhaul of the way our hospital systems function, we would not have the medical technology that we have today if it weren't for those changes that occurred during the two world wars. Now, I am going to give a quick disclaimer before we begin this video, which is that this video will be largely Eurocentric, not because there weren't lots of other important medical developments happening in other areas of the world, but because we are focusing mostly on the two world wars and the changes that occurred in Europe. However, please do know that Europe is not, as many accounts of history will have you believe, the only continent that has ever existed, ever. Okay, so we start in pre-World War I, where most of the most significant changes that had occurred during the 19th century, and these included the use of anesthesia during medical procedures, the development of aseptic and antiseptic operating theaters, and of course the big development of germ theory, which propelled a movement against viral epidemics and reduced the death rate from viral sickness enormously all across Europe and the rest of the world. Now, the most significant thing about the medical field as a whole going into World War I was how utterly unprepared they were for the carnage and devastation they were about to deal with. Without pre-made, stable hospital systems, countries were forced to overthrow many aspects of everyday life for the sector of sickness and death. Colleges, mansions, and other large institutions were taken over as domestic hospitals. One of the most important services during World War I was field transportation for the wounded. The drivers were largely religious citizens who wanted to contribute to the war effort, but they would not handle weapons. Limb amputations were actually far more fatal during World War I than they had ever been before, due to the massive numbers of patients doctors had to deal with, as well as the crowded field hospitals that led to the rapid spread of infections. This was surprising, as the technology for providing amputations was actually far more improved during World War I than in any previous war. Soldiers that were away from the front lines did get better medical care than in any war before, but many amputations and other surgical procedures had to be performed in the field. Although volunteers to drive the field trucks were available, it was difficult to marshal the resources or coordination to have medical units at the front when they were needed to transport wounded soldiers to hospitals where they could be treated. Such a large-scale effort for mobilized medicine had never been attempted before. Of all the available and planned medical deployments, usually half or less were operational at any one time. Even so, the First World War could have stood out as the first war where battlefield deaths were greater, much greater, in fact, than non-battlefield deaths, because the healthcare away from the field was just so much more improved. I say could have, of course, because the 1918 flu pandemic managed to kill about 50 million people globally, which is kind of a big deal. The First World War, socially, also presented a lot of changes within the field of medicine. Minorities who usually had had opportunities denied to them, such as women, suddenly had a much larger presence because of the increased demand for any qualified individuals available. By the end of the war, nearly 27% of all American doctors were in uniform. So, post-World War I.
Oh, I know. So with World War I over, everyone began to use all the new things they had learned, and hospital became the most important thing to the government, right? Healthcare was really good.
Yeah, that would have been great, but no. Basically, every public practice fell apart, and public hospitals were very badly funded after the war. So all the private hospitals and the private doctors competed on insurance schemes, driving the price up, and people who couldn't afford insurance basically just relied on the few beds that were left in public hospitals or on charity beds from private hospitals. However, not everything was lost. There were a lot of big developments that did carry over. So, moving out of the war, the first blood and plasma banks were established in 1935 at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, New York. During the First World War, the use of blood transfusions had seen its first major usage, having just been invented recently. The process was finally made safe, and this would later play a crucial role in the Second World War and all the wars we've had since. Additionally, in wartime, the focus had been on getting soldiers functional so that they could be sent back out to fight for their country. After the war, more emphasis was placed on functional disabilities, like working artificial limbs. There was also a much higher focus on mental trauma, which was now recognized to be a large factor not only in a soldier's capability to operate in the field, but also in civilians who were working in places like factories. Extensive research was carried out on things like fatigue, and soldiers could receive help from healthcare establishments rather than just being institutionalized for their mental problems or relying on meager government pensions for their health care. Socially, big changes were also happening with women's rights in the healthcare system. Women, who had recently been given the right to vote and had been allowed far more involvement in medical practices during the war, began campaigning for an overhaul of midwifing and prenatal practices, especially during the Great Depression. Because apart from maternity benefits, most women remained outside of any kind of state-funded insurance system, as the US and Britain did not legally classify women as workers, and with the tanking economy, this was an essential right that they were looking for. However, due to their concerns about the population post-war, the government eventually gave in to many of the women's demands.
Today, we still lack some equality in women's health care, but prenatal care and maternal benefits have taken leaps and bounds forward in terms of safety and availability. In World War II, we also saw some of the most significant life-saving improvements that we still develop today as a direct result of the most harmful and deadly weapons of the war. To illustrate this point, let's go to the drawing table.
Chemical weapons are usually canisters or containers that release a gas upon impact with the ground. This gas could burn the skin and the mucous membranes, cause various illnesses, and usually death, and it's very often to detect or fight back against. In the Second World War, when the use of chemical warfare agents really took off, governments began investing more and more in researching them, which is probably a good idea considering they were using them to kill a lot of people. While studying substances similar to a type of gas called mustard gas, two pharmacologists at Yale discovered that some nitrogen mustards had the abilities to destroy lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell that is the main agent in lymphatic cancer, which is also known as lymphoma. When tested on a rat with lymphoma, there was a dramatic improvement in its condition, and it was soon used to treat people with lymphoma all over the world. This led to the open development of many other chemotherapies, including aminopterin, which caused huge remission in childhood leukemia, daunorubicin, which acted against a variety of solid tumors and leukemias, and other medicines that introduced new possibilities to diseases that were previously thought to be incurable. Unfortunately, it also created a new phenomenon of cancer cells developing resistance to antibiotics, which is a problem that we deal with today.
World War II also saw the expanded use of antibiotics due to new war-funded research efforts. Sulfa drugs, discovered in 1935, and penicillin, developed in 1939, have led the way to the obvious worldwide benefits of all the uses we have for them today.
Another significant advance during the Second World War was the use of metal plates to help heal fractures. This technique was developed by the German military medical services, and it was discovered by the Allies when they were examining captured German prisoners who had needed x-rays. To the surprise of the medical staff, the German troops were back on duty in half the time compared to normal healing due to these metal plates. The widespread use of metal plates in joints is now common, as we all know. A renal dialysis machine was also a significant invention during the Second World War by Wilhelm Johann Kolff. The first one was made of aluminum, wood, and cellophane and looked quite different than the ones we use today, but it serves as a model for the kidney machines that are used everywhere. It's estimated that the chances of recovery for a badly wounded British infantryman were as much as 25 times better than in the First World War in the Second, due to the use of antibiotics, these new wound treatments, and the use of airplanes as ambulances for treating the wounded. Altogether, the advances in medicine made a dramatic difference for Allied troops, while the Germans, and especially the Japanese and Chinese, suffered from a severe lack of newer medicines, techniques, and facilities.
Overall, the two world wars were incredibly important for the history of medicine. For example, in terms of hospital systems, the National Healthcare System, or the NHS of Britain, was a direct result of World War II. Different hospitals have been paid to set aside beds by the government for civilians and victims of the Blitz, and as a result they had become reliant on government funding. So the NHS was established and many hospitals passed into state property. But it's a debate that we are still talking about today as to whether hospitals can continue with state funding to afford the new technology and all the new developments that are happening as they become more costly to own and operate. Another big development of the two world wars was the World Health Organization, also known as WHO. has been very important in stopping all sorts of viral epidemics and containing very deadly diseases such as smallpox, polio, and more recent tragedies like the Ebola virus. Another big result of the two world wars was the development of plastic and reconstructive surgery and the continuation of development of many functional prosthetics for the disabled. All of these things were used to treat victims of the two world wars that had never been used before in any war previously. The first artificial kidneys used during World War II paved the way for all the amazing artificial organ transplants that we use that save hundreds of lives today. Blood and plasma banks continue to exist all over the world and save lives, and landmark research on sexuality and gender that began during the 40s and the end of the 50s that was previously considered taboo has advanced incredibly. There are groundbreaking steps forward going in ethics research, since the Nazi war ethics that were used during World War II have become a big subject of debate on whether human experimentation is okay and on what grounds. There's also something you should remember, which is that the Nazis were not the only bad guys in this situation. I would like to note that the Japanese war experiments that were performed on soldiers and their enemies alike were incredibly bad, but that the United States has covered up a lot of it so that they can retain the data that was gained. Just something you should be aware of, because often the Nazis are villainized as being the only bad scientists during World War II. So, in conclusion, although that was a bit tangential, without the advances made in medicine during the war, we would not have come as far as we have today, either socially or technologically in medicine. Thanks for paying attention. This video could not have been made without the planning, organizing, and media contributions of Leah Ohms, the editings, drawings, and patience of Zach Hamada, the background music and insightful cameos and information from Robert Zhu, and of course the instructing of our amazing teacher, Ms. Stack, who's already given us an A.